Gambinos. Don't know what to say, it's a bit cold in here. As we're talking, it is in real time. Real time. Yeah? It's New Year's Day. And cold, man. Don't know what to say. So like the Queen, I ain't gonna do an address, but I might read you a little story. I think I will. Never read this before, but I'll try. And if it gets a mucking fuddled up, it ain't my fault. This is called It's Me Against the World. I still cannot recollect what my intention or purpose was in being out so late walking in the city that night, or for that matter, where I was intending to reach. But I do recall walking around those cold and unfriendly streets, city streets, feeling physically, psychologically, socially and spiritually shattered. I felt shell-shocked, as if someone or something had involved me unknowingly and unwittingly in the sequel to the firebombing of Dresden. However, after walking around so aimlessly for what seemed to be a few hours, I began to feel enervated, and so I just propped myself up against the outside window pane of a late night takeaway. Outside the takeaway was a hive of activity. People were milling and buzzing around in every direction. Yet I was alone. I felt isolated within all this inner city farce, and so I just slouched nonchalantly against the window pane, basking within my own anonymity. Then suddenly my eyes caught sight of a woman kissing and embracing another. Her tongue seemed to be so far down the other's throat that it appeared as if she was trying to retrieve her last cherished possession. The one initiating the act appeared to be attractive, yet the other, who at a liberal estimate must have weighed around 23 stones, somehow just didn't. But I guess that neither did I. I looked bad by anybody's account. At the time I was going through my own private hell, my it's me and me only against the world phase, and to try to prove my point to anyone who cared to notice. My psychological state transfused into a physical form. I'd shaved my hair into a mohawk style as I was deluding myself that I looked like a young Robert De Niro, a la his Travis Bickle taxi driver period. But I realise now, in retrospect, that I must have looked more like an amalgamation of the songwriter and artist Ian Jory and the poet and actor Tom Waits and Poodle Murphy, the local pisshead and general all-out waster. But back then I didn't really care anyhow. Reality felt uncomfortable, so I was hiding myself within my delusion, but it felt far better than actuality. I'd lost almost everything within my life that it was possible for a person to lose, with the exception of my sanity. But like a blind person standing at the edge of a cliff top, I knew all too well that I was only one last stumble, one last step away from that terminal drop of drops. So I thought that I deserved my delusion, because I figured that at least I'd got one, and that it was all I had. My stomach was empty of food, as my pockets were of cash. Therefore I decided to pluck up the courage to ask the attractive one of the two, who was holding in her hand a large tray of chips and kebab meat, if I could have a bit of her food. Although I didn't like doing so, as the baggage I was carrying around with me was reminding me that talking to others gets you burned, and I'd sure been walking through that fire. But I was hungry, I mean like hungry. So eventually, in my best De Niro-esque North Nottinghamshire accent, I decided to ask. She replied in a drunken drawl, which seemed to say within its tone that she thought that I seemed either interested or interesting. Of course you can, love. You're homeless, I can see that. I used to be in your position once myself. Take as much as you like. Believe me, I know what it's like to be in your shoes. But I was wearing boots, and I didn't believe her. But I did take a generous handful of her kebab meat, and I ate it like a stray dog. Like a disadvantaged, disengaged and dispossessed outcast of a stray dog. Then after some small talk, which was the initial stages of trying to appear socially viable, I decided to play along with her because I knew that deep down, from the very moment that she had set her inebriated eyes upon my sad, interesting face, that we were both willing participants in some kind of game, and I also knew that she was aware of this. Yet despite the fact that technically I wasn't homeless, I sure felt as if I was, and it felt painful, and that pain was all mine, like the pain that you feel from an aching tooth or a broken jaw, and no amount of verbal explanation to another could convey that pain, and so I just kept quiet. I played along with her and my little game, and because I'd never actually told her that I was homeless, I figured that I hadn't lied. I'd always felt homeless, even when I was living in relative comfort. I'd always felt an affinity with the downtrodden, with old Karl Marx as lumpen proletariats, with the deviants, the damned and the doomed. I felt a brotherhood with the misunderstood. So I guess that after all, she was right. Spiritually, I was homeless. Her eyes met mine, and she said, I'm gonna look after you. I'm gonna take you back to my place. And I'm going to treat you like you've never ever been treated before. Then I thought about the long lonely walk back home to a flat where I'd only got depression for company, and I thought about her promise and that it would be another experience, and if nothing else, how experience goes a long way within the big scheme of things, within this mad, bad, sad, crazy crocodile of society, and within this mishmash, broken bag of crap that is life. So I decided to go for her offer, and then I said, okay then, take me wherever. I'm not so fussy, you know. She knew. She called it taxi cab. The fat girl kissed her goodbye, then left. When the cab arrived, we both got inside, and she said, "Do you drink, love?" To this, deep within me, I smiled, but I didn't let it show on my face. I just thought, what a question to ask me in a world full of questions. I felt like saying, if a person farts on a packed underground train, then will anyone smell it? Or, if the actress Brooke Shields was a virgin, and so was I. But instead I just said, yeah, just a bit. Just a big bit, in fact. Anyhow, after a short journey, she ordered the taxi driver to stop. He just smiled, saying nothing. Then we pulled up outside a Rastafarian nightclub, a place that I'd known from around 9 years earlier, where I'd witnessed an event that I'd rather forget. She got out of the cab and walked into the club. After a good 10 minutes or so of waiting, with the exchange of silence with the driver, she came walking out, clutching within her arms 9 cans of Jamaican Red Stripe lager. She opened the car door and got inside. She said, "Take us back to my place, Charlie." The driver said nothing, and we set off. And she said, when we get back to my place, you leave it all up to me. Don't you say anything, because Bill might still be up waiting for me. And if he is, I'll do all the talking, okay? I'll tell him that you're an old friend of mine who's just staying for the night on the sofa. To all this, I just nodded. She knew the game all right, and I was just coming along for the ride. I had little to say, so I just asked her for a can. And I finished the can as we arrived outside her place. I got out of the cab. She paid the driver, and he just smiled at me. A smile which behind it seemed to say, "You sure picked one here, mate." The streets in which her house was situated were without litter, and with signs on all the street lamps that warned that if anyone's dog crapped on the pavement, then the owners would have to fork out a 400 quid fine. It was Pooper Scooper Street, a nice street. A street where the so-called respectable folk lived. The houses were all the same, all with long driveways and fake old English Tudor black and white fronts, kind of Jacobean. Subconsciously, I guess that I was impressed, yet consciously, I was worried. I felt like a fish just thrown out of its bowl by a snarling cat. I was just about to pounce. I felt like a puzzled person, but then I guessed that I was a very puzzled person. Yet somehow I felt pleased with myself and lucky at my ability so far to pull it all off. She was far too pissed to open the door, so I did the honours, and then once outside we walked through a hallway which was larger in size than my whole high-rise flat. Then eventually we entered the lounge. Amongst all this opulence, I felt both lost and found. She suspected rightly, as waking up for her, sitting in a leather armchair, was Bill, a balding giant of a man of about 60 years of age. His face told me that I had seen better days, and the beer belly informed me that he liked the odd tipple every now and again, like every day. "Caroline, where you been all this time?" he said. And then he went on, "I thought that at least you would have given me a bell if you were going to be out till this late at night." Caroline said nothing and went to the drinks cabinet and poured herself a large vodka. Bill seemed to pretend that he'd not noticed my existence. But then after a few minutes of tense silence, he said to Caroline, "Who's this then?" Caroline replied, "It's an old friend of mine. I haven't seen him in years. I've told you about him many times. Don't you remember? He's the little guy who I used to work with at the tax office." I just kept my mouth shut and sat there on the leather suite, looking more like Stig of the Dump than an ex-civil servant. Bill appeared to believe her, and after wishing me good night, he left the room. And Caroline sprang on me, kissing me on the neck, cheeks, lips, like a hungry woman. But Caroline was a hungry woman. And after seeing Big Bill, I could hardly blame her. I put my left hand on her right breast and I squeezed it tight. She just pushed it away and says, "Nah, later, I want you. But wait till he's asleep. I'll be down to see you in a while." And she went out of the room, perhaps to pacify Big Bill. For about half an hour I just lay there on the leather couch, sipping a mixture of Red Stripe and vodka, which tasted like poison. It was poison, but it made me feel all warm inside. By the time I'd taken off my leather jacket, but I'd kept on my t-shirt, trousers and my metal toe-cap boots, just in case of an emergency, as Bill looked as strong as a gorilla, and I realised that with my 5'4" stature, that if Bill wanted to go apeshit on me, I was going to be hurt. Therefore, it seemed a good safety precaution to keep the boots on, as then perhaps they would act as an equaliser. Yeah, I finished off the drink as Caroline came back into the room, wearing a dressing gown, a basque and a pair of fishnet stockings. She looked ridiculous, like a player in a cheap pornography film. She was Nicholas, and her snatch was showing for all the world and me to see. It felt strange, but I was drunk, and I thought, what the hell? Then she sat down next to me and grabbed onto me like a limpet. Then began her tongue down my alimentary canal, you know, that kind of routine. But before turning on her side and pushing out her great big arse and saying, "Come on, love, make love to me." But I just couldn't. Something just came all over me. And I felt like a virgin all over again, like Brooke Shields, like a rabbit caught in the headlights of a Rolls Royce. I was startled. Then she turned, saying, "What's the matter, love? Are you gay or something? You can tell me." So I told her that I wasn't gay. And then slowly, feeling tense and nervous, I told her the truth of how I was still in love with a woman that I'd lived with for almost 10 years. Had burned me 8 months previously. She listened intently to my tale, and what I told her was all true. Then after I'd finished my little heartbreaker, she began to become all lachrymose, and in a voice which contained regret, she said, "I'm sorry, love, I understand. You're a good man. It's all my fault. I'm sorry for picking on you." I told her that it was okay, and after an emotionally shared glass of vodka, we fell into each other's arms. And at last, I felt like warm and secure, and all my frustration and tension just flooded away. Yet, as I reached the sweet no man's land that lies somewhere between consciousness and sleep, I heard the shouts of an irate voice. "Caroline, where are you?" I sprang up to discover that looking down at me was the face of King Kong. It was Bill, and he didn't seem too happy, but he just looked at me and said nothing. As Caroline was obviously asleep, he walked out of the room, back to bed, saying to himself, "This time it's really it, Caroline. You've done it now. This is the last time that you take me for an idiot." I thought to myself that old Bill must have seen all this before. And I pushed my body up against hers, and after a short while I fell asleep. When I awoke, it must have been early, because I saw through the window that it wasn't yet full light. Caroline was still fast asleep. And after a good half hour of sitting down and observing the decor, I went to the cabinet and I poured myself a vodka, which was more like a breakfast than the hair of the dog. Then I sat back and sipped it slowly, throwing myself wholeheartedly into its warm glow. By now the world that existed beyond the window somehow looked more appealing. But then Bill walked into the room. It was all belly, braces and vest, and I thought to myself, "Oh shit, here we go." And standing over me was what I thought to be 6 foot, pure raging ape shit. And so I sprang to my feet and I waited to greet the first fist of many. But instead he just said, "Good morning, lad. Did you sleep well last night?" His voice was amiable, but I was stunned. I told him that I'd slept well. Then he asked if I wanted any breakfast. Dumbstruck, I said, "Yeah." And he said, "What do you want? Baked beans or tomatoes?" "Both," I replied. Then he left the room. Big Bill had surprised me. He surprised me all right. So I poured myself another vodka, then downed it. Now I felt more relaxed and complacent, as Bill seemed to look more now like a big child on a Christmas morning than the golem that I had envisaged previously. Then I heard a pleasant voice shout, "Well, come and get it, lad. It's ready and on the table. I don't mess about with food, you know." I knew. Bill was quick. I went into the kitchen and I sat down at a table across from him. The kitchen looked like an advert out of a magazine, like a photograph out of Hello magazine. I felt like saying to Bill, "Who's been sleeping in my head?" because my head hurt. My head felt like Vietnam, but I didn't. Instead, I just ate the breakfast, and what a breakfast. It was 2 eggs, beans, tomatoes, 2 sausages, and 4 slices of toast, accompanied by a large mug of coffee. I finished the breakfast and left the coffee. No words were exchanged between Bill and me, only pleasant gestures and a smile. But I suppose that there were no words to say, as all had been said. So after relaxing and letting the food settle, I told Bill that I was going. "All right then, son, take care, how you go," Bill said in a voice at one with me, and I walked back into the lounge and grabbed my jacket. On the table I spotted £40 in £10 notes, together with 2 packs of Super King cigarettes. I left the money, as I wasn't a thief, but I was a chain smoker, so I took 10 of the cigarettes and I pushed them deep into my jacket pocket. Caroline was lying on the leather sofa with her big backside raised up, trying her best to pretend to be asleep. But as she was so obviously awake, I walked over to her and I kissed her arse cheek. She turned and smiled and said, "I'll see you later." "Yeah, perhaps," I replied, knowing all too well that we got more chance of appearing on a television show together and winning a holiday in Jamaica. Then I opened the front door, walked down the driveway, and once more I was back on the street. I pulled on the jacket to discover that Caroline or Bill had pushed into my pockets 2 cans of Red Stripe. I took out a can from the pocket, pulled the ring pull, and slowly felt the trickle down my throat. It felt good, but I felt lost. I'd never been in the area before, and as the game was all over, suddenly I realised that soon I'd have to make it back to my 14th story prison, and the realisation of this hurt. But then I thought that at least I'd been lucky, as I got 2 cans of good lager and 10 cigarettes for company on the journey home. And I lit a cigarette and I walked on in a straight line half a mile or so, until in front of me I could see a blurred building, out of which I heard emanating a familiar song. It was the song "The Old Rugged Cross." My mother had once told me that it had been my grandmother's favourite song. And although I never met her, still, for some reason, I kind of began to feel a little emotional. As I got closer to the building, I realised that it was a Methodist church, so I walked up to take a closer look. Above the doorway, I read a sign which proclaimed, "Jesus is the answer." At the time, I didn't know anything about Methodism, but I had an opinion about Jesus, and I also remembered that somehow, someone had once told me about the Methodists, and that they'd kind of sprang up from the Tolpuddle martyrs, and that they were supposed to be down-to-earth people. So after finishing the can, for some reason, I decided to walk into the place. Perhaps I was searching for God. Perhaps I was just passing time. Perhaps I was just mesmerised by the song or the sign. Perhaps a combination of all. I don't know. Anyway, once inside the church, it all seemed to look like a television programme what I saw as a kid. Stars on Sunday. And I was waiting for Harry Seacombe to appear so that I could congratulate him on his contribution to the Goon Show. But sadly, he wasn't there. So I pulled out the last of the cans, undid the ring pull and slowly sipped it. Then I began to listen intently to the minister who was at the front of the congregation conducting a sermon. He was preaching on about an old man called Noah, who he claimed had been instructed by God to save the humans and animal kingdom from the threat of extinction. I listened to what he was saying for about 30 minutes, and in an allegorical way, it seemed to make kind of sense. His Noah appeared to be a kind of cosmic forerunner to the pop singer Sir Bob Geldof. After a while, all his talk sent my head spinning, so much so that I began to recall a book that I'd read by Julian Barnes called A History of the World in 10.5 chapters. In that book, Barnes had also mentioned God and Noah, only it seemed that he'd burnt them all. He'd smashed them all to bits. He said that they were nothing more than mythical characters who were promoted by the church for an elaborate con trick. After thinking about the book and listening to the guy in the dog collar and robe, suddenly I began to realise that all Barnes had implied was true, and that what the minister was preaching was merely the dogma of religion. In my opinion, historically speaking at that time, religion had always been the cause of far more death and destruction and disorder in the world than any other ideology. However, by this time I was a little drunk and I was feeling uninhibited. So I decided to let the minister know and the congregation of my discontent. Therefore, in the loudest voice that I could muster, I shouted, "If Jesus is the answer, then it's a bloody stupid question, because if he existed, logic would say that it was just a socialist leader or else a megalomaniac nutter. But whatever he was, I'm sure that it was murdered by reactionary people like you lot. And if he was knocking around today, I bet that he wouldn't be in your church anyway. I bet he'd be probably outside having a beer with me." So I thought, stuff these puritanical, sanctimonious sods. All my ranting, the turnip heads in the congregation just looked at me stunned. So I got up from the bench and I walked off outside. I'd tried to believe in their God, but had failed. Evidently, their God wasn't my God. I suppose that if I had a God at that time, mine was one that was somewhere within the spirit of a bottle of Jack Daniels, or within the pages of the books of Thomas Paine. Because Paine and Daniels made far more sense to me than what was in the Bible. In the Bible I'd read that God was an all-loving, omnipotent being who had created all and everything within the world, and therefore I believe that if this was true, then he must have been responsible for creating evil, and regarded evil to be at work everywhere within the world, as even the cat tortured its prey before killing it, and had regarded this to be an act of evil, because the cat obviously did it for no other purpose than its own sadistic pleasure. I experienced this sensation of evil in Eastern Europe whilst I was photographing the sites of former Nazi concentration camps as part of a degree thing. At Auschwitz, I'd photographed the sites of former Nazi concentration camps, and there I'd felt evil in the air like a fever. Also at that place I'd first decided to denounce the very notion of the existence of God, because I believed that if he was loving, omnipotent, and he was a super being, then why hadn't he intervened and stopped the atrocities that were taking place in the camps when millions of innocent people were choking on the Cyclone B gas? Or for that matter, why hadn't he ordered Pope Pius XII to condemn the Nazis? Because the Pope was very familiar with the intentions of the Nazis to annihilate the Jews. The reason for this and the Holocaust, in my mind, was simple and plain. God just did not exist. My proof of this was in failing to stop the Holocaust, all claims of his omnipotence were rendered invalid. Also, I believe that if he'd chosen not to intervene through an indifference to human suffering, that neither could he be regarded as loving. Therefore, in the absence of these biblically attributed qualities, then by the Bible's very own criteria, he could not possibly exist. However, once I was outside the church, again, I decided not to bother with troubling my mind any further with any more notions about their non-existent deity. So I just lit up a cigarette and spat on the pavement before proceeding to walk home. Finally, when I reached the tower block where I lived, used my security key to open the heavy metal security door, and as I walked inside to catch the lift, I noticed what someone had written in black marker pen upon the green felt notice board that was high up on the wall. Fuck religion, let's have humanism for all. As the old building was under 24-hour surveillance, my first thought on seeing this was, how could someone be so stupid as to write it? But then it struck me that I'd been far more stupid than myself, as the graffiti had made me realise that it wasn't a case of it's me and me only against the world, as there were many others who also felt the same way as I did. Then I concluded that fundamentally everyone was in the same boat, and that all of us were living in the same pot of piss in a society that treated people's lives as if they were just disposable pieces of Tupperware. Then I thought once more about Jesus, and I finally decided that it was just another socialist who was murdered by the mob of church and state and law. Hope that makes sense. I ain't ever read it before, but it's New Year's Day now. It's quite early. I ain't even had a cup of tea to wake myself up, so I'm going to go for one. Anyway, as Stuart Adamson used to sign autographs, with respect. And stay alive. Yeah, stay alive in 2013. Whatever you're doing. Whether you're shoeing a horse or you're on a boat eating pies being fed to you by supermodels in the south of France. Have a good year and stay alive. Thanks.